think we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Welcome everyone to the Global PrEP Learning Network. We're just allowing a few moments for folks to join. In the meantime, you're welcome to introduce yourself in the chat. We're glad to have you with us here today. Lauren, when I look at my chat, it does not actually give me, oh no, there it is, sorry. For a moment, I thought I couldn't say hello to everyone, but.
Yep, it should have just clicked on.
Yeah.
There we go. Morgan is on nice and early. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, welcome everyone. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get going. It's 2 minutes after the hour, and I know folks are still joining, but let's go ahead and get started since we only have an hour together today. Next slide, please. So welcome today to the Global PrEP Learning Network. We are really excited to talk about new data and new opportunities and the expanding evidence base for the PrEP ring. We have an exciting program ahead of us with some background information and then a summary of the new data emerging from the REACH study, the DELIVER study, the Be Protected study, and some reflections from our colleague from WHO. Next slide, please. So I am Kristine Torjesen from FHI 360, and I'm the Mosaic Project Director, and I'm happy to be your co-host today, along with my co-host Chantel Manganye from Wits Reproductive Health Institute in South Africa. Chantel is a community liaison officer, a HIV prevention ambassador, and a member of the Mosaic Next Gen Squad, and she's a former participant in the REACH study, which we'll hear more about today. She supports the demand creation and mobilization, implementation research, gender integration, and civil society advocacy teams as part of Mosaic. Over to you, Chantel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kristine, for the nice introduction. Like Kristine has just mentioned, I am a former REACH participant that took place in South Africa. The REACH study was based on the acceptability of oral PrEP and the Jhpiego ring between women who are ages 16 to 21. Thank you. Over to you, Kristine.
I think we can move ahead with introductions, Chantel.
Okay, great. Carolyne Akello is a medical doctor, a epidemiologist, and a Mosaic project director in Uganda. Prior to joining FHI 360, Akello was an investigator with the REACH/MTN 034 study. She has worked in various capacities on several studies of PrEP products for HIV prevention under the MTN and the HPTN. Katie Bunge is a practicing obstetrician and a gynecologist at the University of Pittsburgh. She served as a safety physician with the microbicide trials network for the PrEP ring clinical trials and is actually acting as one of the protocol chairs for DELIVER MTN 042. Within the last year, she has taken on the roles within the Mosaic and Matrix programs. Next slide. And now we have the director, Lisa Noguchi, is a director for maternal and newborn health at Jhpiego. She's a nurse, midwife, infectious disease, and epidemiologist and certified professional in patient safety. She was protocol co-chair for the Be Protected/MTN 043 study and is a member of the WHO Antenatal Care Guideline Development Group. We also have Michelle Rodolph, who is a technical officer with the HIV testing, prevention and populations team of the Global HIV, Hepatitis and STI programs at the World Health Organization. She leads the ARV-based HIV prevention work for WHO, including the development of new policy and guidance on PrEP, PEP, and future prevention products.
Thank you so much, Chantel,
Thank you,
for those
Kristine.
introductions. So we have a few slides today to just set the stage before we go into our main presentations. So first, I just wanted to share a bit of background on the Jhpiego vaginal ring in case some folks on the call are less familiar with this. This is a silicone vaginal ring that was developed by the International Partnership for Microbicides and is now being managed and distributed by the Population Council. And it slowly releases the antiretroviral drug Jhpiego over 1 month. It can be self-inserted and worn continually for 1 month. It was shown to reduce HIV acquisition by 35% in the RAIN study, 27% in the ASPIRE study, and it has demonstrated a strong safety profile. In the open label extension studies, the HIV acquisition was reduced even further, greater than 50% with consistent use. And there are some exploratory analyses that suggest that HIV acquisition could be reduced even further, up to 75 to 91% in those who are the most adherent to the product. It's a product that can be kept at room temperature and has a long shelf life. Next slide. The current regulatory status of this product is that it has been approved by the WHO for use among cisgender women aged 18 and older who are at substantial risk of HIV and unwilling or unable to use oral PrEP. It has also been approved by multiple regulatory agencies in Africa, including in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Uganda, and others. It did have originally a FDA application made in the US, but that was withdrawn based on data that it was unlikely to support use of this product in the context of the HIV prevention landscape for women in the United States. PEPFAR currently supports the RAIN procurement for research only and not for program delivery. And part of this is related to a US law that restricts purchasing of antiretroviral products to only those by PEPFAR to only those that are FDA approved. However, the Global Fund is supporting RAIN procurement for program delivery, and there are multiple planned and ongoing implementation studies underway that include the PrEP RAIN. Next slide. So why we're excited today to hear about the REACH and Deliver and Be Protected studies is that we recognize that these data will help support the use of the RAIN in very vulnerable populations. So women and girls bear a disproportionate burden of HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, 46% of new HIV infections were among women and girls in 2022, and 4,000 adolescent girls and young women aged 15 to 24 years became infected with HIV globally in 2022. Next slide. We also know that the group of women of reproductive age is a growing population, particularly in Africa, which is the continent that is most impacted by HIV transmission. Next slide. And that incident HIV infections during pregnancy and breastfeeding contribute to a substantial proportion of vertical transmissions. So having HIV prevention options during this time period of adolescence and pregnancy and breastfeeding is really important. Next slide. When we look at the different HIV prevention options, particularly during pregnancy and breastfeeding, we have variation across the products in how much safety data is available. So there's a lot of safety data for the use of oral PrEP during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And now we have an increasingly strong evidence base for the safety of RAIN PrEP during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And then CAB PrEP has studies underway right now that are looking at the safety of that product during pregnancy and breastfeeding. Next slide. But currently, when we look at the PrEP reign around among a number of different countries in Africa, we can see that only a few of them actually allow the use of the PrEP reign during pregnancy and breastfeeding, and none of them allow the use of the reign in individuals who are younger than 18 years of age. So our hope is that, as these additional data and evidence emerge around the safety of the reign in these particular groups, that this table will change, and that in the future we will see a lot more yeses and less nos. Next slide. So I just want to thank those who contributed to these slides and move it on to our next presenter, which is Carolyne Akello, who will tell us about the REACH study. And I'll just say that I also encourage everyone to put questions in the chat as we go along. Over to you, Carolyne.
Oh, thank you so much, Kristine, for that preamble. And now on to PrEP ring use for adolescent girls and young women. And I'm going to share data from the recently published REACH study. And this was also presented at IAS 2021 and PROE 2022 last year. So as a way of introduction, adolescent girls and young women account for most new HIV infections in Africa. As Christina said, about 46% of new infections in 2022 were in this age group. And we all know that WHO recommends daily oral PrEP and a monthly dapivine vaginal ring for women at risk of HIV acquisition. So a safety study of the PrEP ring amongst adolescent girls and young women, that is the MTN-023 study that was done in girls 15 to 17 years, demonstrated a similar safety profile amongst the age group, the adolescents, as among other older trial populations. So we are really confident that the ring is actually safe for use amongst adolescent girls and young women and also older women. And given low adherence amongst adolescent girls and young women in efficacy trials, we assessed the safety, product choice, and adherence to the ring and oral PrEP among African adolescent girls and young women in the REACH trial. Next slide, please. And REACH stands for Reversing the Epidemic in Africa with Choices in HIV Prevention. It is an acronym. And it had a very interesting study design, one of the best, I should say. So in this study, girls from South Africa, Uganda, and Zimbabwe were enrolled. And at enrollment, they had to be willing to use both oral PrEP and the dapivine vaginal ring. And they were randomized to use to start with either dapivine vaginal ring or oral PrEP for the first 6 months. And then they crossed over to the other product that they had not used initially. So in the crossover period, we had two groups. Group A had initially started with dapivine vaginal ring, and then they crossed over to oral PrEP. And Group B started with oral PrEP in the first 6 months, and then they crossed over to the dapivine vaginal ring in the next 6 months. And the last 6 months was called the choice period, where the girls and young women were actually given a liberty to choose whichever product they really wanted to use that best suited their lifestyle, either oral PrEP, the dapivine vaginal ring, or no product at all. And after 6 months, they were exited from the study. So it was an 18-month study. And importantly, during the course of the study, we provided the girls with a diverse menu of adherence support options. And these included daily text messages or a weekly check-in, either via text message or a phone call. We also offered a peer buddy if they really wanted one, but also additional counseling visits, adherence support groups, either in person or virtually, but also anything else that the girls felt really would enhance their use of these products. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share the results that we got from the REACH study. So in terms of baseline characteristics, the average age was about 18 years. Most were not married, they were single, about 87%. And about 40% had ever been pregnant. And yes, also 40% had just were new users of contraceptive methods and had commenced it in the last 70 years. And most of them had at least attained secondary school education, with about 40% being currently in school and 21% earning their own income. Next slide, please. So, and in terms of the adverse events that we experienced in the study, about 54% experienced at least one product-related adverse event. However, there was no difference in the total number of reportable adverse events experienced during ring use and oral PrEP use. And also, it's important to note that no adverse events were related to product holds or discontinuations, or maybe SAEs, serious adverse events. And the most commonly reported adverse events were decreased creatinine, clearance, and headache, which most probably was due to oral PrEP. And then chlamydia was really a common STI that was seen amongst this age group. Next slide, please. But also to note that most of the adverse events were really mild to moderate. Yes. So in terms of product choice, in the third period, about 2/3 from this pie chart, you can see 67% of them chose to use the ring over oral PrEP. 31% chose to use oral PrEP, and just 2% chose not to use any method. Next slide, please. And in terms of adherence, because in this study, we actually wanted to look at adherence was really one of the key questions that we're asking. We assessed adherence. The ring adherence was based on estimated the pivirine release calculated using the residual drug levels in the return rings. If the levels were less than 0.9 milligrams, then that was non-use. Remember that the ring is a 28 milligram ring, and it was designed to actually release 4 milligrams over a 28-day period. So if there was at least some release of 0.9 to less than 4 milligrams, then that was some use. And if there was more than 4 milligrams of the pivirine release, then that was really consistent with 28 days of use. And for oral PrEP, we measured it via tenofovir diphosphate levels in dried blood spots. So if there was less than 16 femtomoles in the DBS punches, then that was non-use. And some use was about 16 to 700 femtomoles. And then high adherence was over 700 femtomoles per DBS punch, which actually was equivalent to about at least swallowing drugs worth 4 days or more in a week. So we compared the proportion of visits with high adherence between those that actually used the ring and also oral PrEP. Next slide, please. And it is interesting to note that overall, from those graphs that we are seeing, the yellow indicating at least some use, and then the green really indicating high use, and the red indicating no or low adherence to the product. So from the graphs that you see, for oral PrEP, there was consistent use of product in the crossover period, but also in the choice period. And for the ring, we can also see that, there is also use of product, although we have some reds, meaning that, there was also some no to low adherence to study product. And however, these were in about 5% of visits were categorized as no or low product adherence. And you can see that in the choice period, these visits were actually much less than in the crossover period, showing that once people, whichever method a participant, was inclined to use, when they chose it in the choice period, then they were really more likely to utilize it. Next slide, please. Use it more adherently. Next slide, please. And still with adherence during the crossover period, because that is when we really wanted to see how the adherence was to a method that the client actually opted to use and how their subsequent product choice was. We noted that actually for oral PrEP, there was high adherence in the crossover period, and it was strongly associated with choice of oral PrEP. So whoever chose to use oral PrEP, they actually used it more consistently. But also for the ring, they use it a little bit more consistently, but however, for oral PrEP, this was more statistically significant. And of course, for the ring, no such association was observed for ring choice. However, it really goes on to show that whatever method someone chooses to use, opts to use, then they're more likely to use it more consistently than if they were just to be given a method. And that is why PrEP choice is something that is really very important in determining consistent product use and persistence. Next slide, please. So in summary, we can see that both products were well tolerated and highly acceptable, since the safety profile was actually almost as that in the older trials, older women trials. And among African adolescent girls who had experience with both ring and oral PrEP, about 2/3 opted to use the ring when given a choice of products. And I know Chantel, but also the girls said that, it was more user-friendly. The ring was discreet, and it was easier to use than having to swallow a pill every day. Remembering to swallow a pill every day was difficult. So the ring kind of blended a bit better with their lifestyles. And participants with higher adherence to oral PrEP in the crossover period were more likely to choose oral PrEP when given a choice. Drug levels throughout the crossover period and choice periods indicate partial to higher adherence for both products, although this is really much higher than in previous studies, both of older women, but also for adolescent girls. So in the REACH trial, we saw that adherence was really much higher than had ever been seen before, which really shows that adolescent girls and young women can make informed choices about HIV prevention. And especially when they're supported, then adherence can actually be much higher and much better. Thank you so much for your attention. I would like to acknowledge the REACH site staff and participants, and also the REACH study teams in all the other countries that were actually able to provide these results. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carolyne, for that presentation. We'll now move over to hear the DELIVER study findings from Katie Bunge.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I love all three of these studies so much, and I'm thrilled that we're able to share the results. Next slide, please. I'm going to take us through what we know about the PrEP ring in pregnancy. I think maybe the slides are a little. Can you backtrack one slide? I wonder if I. Okay, well, we'll just dive in. I'm going to talk to you about the DELIVER study. Next slide, please. This was a study of the safety of the depivirine vaginal ring in a pregnant cohort, and the design is really cool, not unlike the REACH design. So it takes a second to understand. The key to it is that we have 3 different cohorts. So it was conducted in a stepwise fashion, and we started with a cohort that was 36 weeks or greater pregnant. Gave them the ring, and then moved on once that cohort had delivered and to the second cohort, which was 30 to 35 weeks pregnant, and then the third cohort, which was 12 to 29 weeks pregnant. So the key eligibility criteria included being 18 to 40 years old, a singleton pregnancy, an ultrasound confirmed gestational age, and no history of pregnancy complications. The participants were randomly assigned to use either the monthly ring or daily PrEP, oral PrEP, until delivery, and the randomization scheme varied by cohort. So for cohort 1, the participants were randomized 2 to 1. That also for cohort 2, and then for cohort 3, the participants were randomized 4 to 1, ring to oral PrEP. What's really amazing to me, I think, about the study design is this interim safety review that occurred at the end of each cohort. The review was conducted by an independent panel, and that panel allowed us to move on to the next cohort. So, for example, if you're looking at the figure on the right, 150 participants were in cohort 1. They used the ring until delivery. Once the babies were all born from cohort 1, the safety review panel reviewed the safety data and said, yes, go on to the next cohort, which went on to cohort 2 and then cohort 3. The reason why we started with later gestational age is because you could imagine that the risks associated with product use would be highest earlier in gestation. The bulk of our safety data from the use of the ring in pregnancy comes from cohort 3, because those participants, first of all, there are many more of them in that cohort. There's also a higher randomization scheme, 4 to 1, and also they're using the ring for a much longer time through the duration of their pregnancy. So for what I'm going to present today is what has been published and is really focusing on cohort 1 and cohort 2. Next slide, please. There were 4 sites for our DELIVER trial: Uganda, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Next slide, please. And for the data that I'll present today, the pregnancy outcomes and complications were assessed for up to 6 weeks post-delivery and then summarized using descriptive statistics. In the trial, participants came back quite often, every 2 weeks, alternating with telephone visits. So we had close contact with the participants to assess adverse events. And then we had a post-pregnancy outcome visit, which was scheduled for both maternal and infant participants within 2 weeks of delivery. And at that visit, we clarified what kind of outcome happened, whether it was a full-term delivery, a preterm delivery, a loss. Mothers actually exited the study after 6 weeks post-delivery. We followed the infants, though, for a year. The pregnancy outcomes and complications that I'll present today were compared to local background rates obtained through a systematic chart review, which was a study called MTN-042B. This was a really amazing, heroic effort at our sites, completely separate from Deliver, but advised by our stakeholders to obtain local background data so that we could understand the outcome and complication data from Deliver in the context of the sites where we were conducting a study. So in a span of 2 months, each site reviewed delivery charts from their local hospitals. In total, it was over 10,000 charts that they reviewed to get pregnancy outcomes and complications for the population in which the Deliver trial was conducted. Next slide, please. This is our schema of participant disposition. You'll see that they were randomized, so not surprisingly, there were equal numbers in each arm. What is most impressive, I think, is that more than 95% of expected maternal visits were completed. Between the different arms, demographic and clinical characteristics were similar for each cohort. Next slide, please. This is a table outlining the pregnancy outcomes for both cohort 1 on the top and cohort 2. Next slide. Next, if you could click it. Yeah, what I want to point out is that full-term deliveries were the most common outcome for cohort 1 and for cohort 2, and were similar between arms. Next slide, please. Oh, I will point out stillbirths. There was one stillbirth in the Truvada arm for cohort 1 and one stillbirth in the defibrillin ring for cohort 2. Next slide. This is a table demonstrating the complications. What you'll see on the left in the column are the different types of complications that were actively looked for our Deliver participants. The most common complication were hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. I have highlighted the box of that to demonstrate that there was no difference between the arms in either cohort. And then I wanted to highlight down below the fever of unclear origin, the fever of unclear etiology, the endochoreo, and the postpartum endometritis, because I think as we think about ring use in pregnancy, before we did the study, that was a point of concern that many stakeholders raised. Will having this foreign object in the vagina during pregnancy increase the risk of infections? And what we have demonstrated quite clearly is no, that there was no difference in pregnancy complications, including infectious complications, between the ring and the oral PrEP arm. Next slide, please. This is a brief overview of the maternal and infant safety data. There were no HIV seroconversions in either arm. In either cohort, there were no maternal deaths. In maternal and infant serious adverse events in grade 3 or higher AEs, which was actually our primary safety outcome, were comparable between study arm and cohorts. There were 2 infant deaths. I mentioned the 2 stillbirths, but the infant deaths occurred, one in cohort 1 and one in cohort 2. Neither was deemed to be related to study product. Next slide, please. In terms of acceptability and adherence, what we found is that pregnant people are like other people, that the ring was a new formulation and participants were able to use the ring without issues and fears, but it did require education and counseling from providers. And having past ring users share their experience was incredibly helpful. We have looked at some preliminary adherence data and can comment that it's quite encouraging and that we feel confident that the safety data that I'm presenting right now are actually reflective of people using the product. Next slide, please. In terms of limitations, only uncomplicated single-term pregnancies were included. By design, the cohorts that I'm presenting here were short, and the numbers are small. And so if we're looking for rare pregnancy outcomes, complications, we wouldn't find it. The huge strengths of this study, I think, are the fact that the stakeholders requested MTN 042B be conducted so that we could have a nice background rate to compare our outcomes and complications to. We also used standardized definitions as best as possible, and we had excellent retention. The bottom line is that the PrEP ring is safe and acceptable for use during pregnancy. There were no HIV seroconversions in either arm. Next slide, please. I'd like to acknowledge mostly the participants, because asking a person to enroll in a study to study the safety of an investigational product in pregnancy is a big ask. And our participants were amazing. They had a lot of trust in our sites staff, which also really were just outstanding, conducting this entire trial during COVID and having such excellent retention. I think speaks to the participants' trust in our site staff. Thanks. I think I get to introduce Lisa Noguchi to present the next slides.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Noguchi, Director for Maternal Newborn Health at Jhpiego, and I was co-chair of the MTN 043 study. Next slide. I am sharing these results on behalf of a much larger, fantastic team that supported the Be Protected study. So I want you all to think about, in your community, what options do HIV-negative women have to prevent getting an HIV infection while they're breastfeeding? And it may be different, it may be the same as in my community, and that is there not a whole lot of options. We have oral PrEP, which works very well, but we know that women benefit from having a number of different options. And that's part of the reason why we did the MTN 043 study. Next slide, please. So breastfeeding is super important. We know that WHO recommends breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding, for the first 6 months of life for infants, and then continued breastfeeding with complementary food thereafter for a number of years. Undernutrition is a leading cause of child deaths, and breastfeeding has a number of benefits for both infants and mothers. Next slide. We also know that HIV infection during breastfeeding is responsible for nearly a quarter of vertical HIV transmission in Eastern and Southern Africa. Incident HIV infection during the postnatal period is particularly high and is associated with a higher risk of vertical transmission. So making sure that women have options to protect themselves against HIV during this period is super, super important. Next slide. But we know that not all effective biomedical HIV prevention strategies are available to breastfeeding populations. As Kristine mentioned earlier, we have some places where the ring is now approved. WHO guidelines do recommend the ring for HIV prevention, but the guidelines don't yet include, as was mentioned earlier, pregnant or breastfeeding populations due to data gaps that we are filling right now. Injectable long-acting CAB is also on the horizon, potentially for use during breastfeeding, but more research and safety surveillance are needed. Next slide. So the Be Protected trial was actually done at the same sites where we did the MTN 042 Deliver trial that Katie just described. We enrolled healthy HIV-negative breastfeeding mother-infant pairs, and they were randomized 3-to-1, vaginal ring to PrEP. And the reason why we had more of the participants randomized to the PrEP ring as opposed to oral PrEP was because we actually needed more data on the ring. We have a lot of great safety data, acceptability data for oral PrEP, including some during breastfeeding, but the data gap really was among breastfeeding mother-infant pairs. So the product exposure was designed to be 12 weeks. So during the early period of the infant's life, starting at least 6 weeks old. Next slide. So the study visit schedule is shown here. We collected adverse event data, and we also spent a fair bit of the study time looking at drug concentrations, how much drug actually passes from the ring to the maternal bloodstream, to the breast milk, and then to the baby. And we also looked at residual drug levels in the ring, and Carolyne did a great job of describing how and why we did that. And we looked at acceptability as well, using a questionnaire. Next slide. So the objectives and the endpoints are shown here, but the bottom line is the questions we were trying to answer: were these products safe for mom and baby? How much medication passed to babies? And did users like and use the products? Next slide. And we did, as I mentioned, enroll exclusive breastfeeding moms. So why was this important? Well, we know that once complementary foods are started, cereals, rice cereals, grains, etc., the risk of foodborne illness increases for babies. And so we didn't want this to be confused with product safety. Same thing with pharmacokinetics. We can understand the maximum likely potential drug exposure for infants if infants are exclusively breastfeeding. And also for the impact on breastfeeding, we're going to get more accurate estimates among women who are exclusively breastfeeding. Next slide. And here are the characteristics of the moms who enrolled and the babies. Generally, these moms were in their 20s. They were multiparous, meaning they had had multiple babies. They had a primary partner. Their babies were more likely to be 6 to 9 weeks old. And I think we had slightly more female babies than male babies, but that was just kind of by chance and similar between groups. On average, the groups of women who used the PrEP ring and who used oral PrEP were pretty similar. Next slide. What we found for safety was really excellent news and consistent with all the other ring studies that have been done. Really excellent safety profiles, of course, for the oral PrEP and for Jhpiego vaginal ring. We saw a few no serious adverse events were related. We did see a few serious adverse events, but none of them were related to study product for mothers or babies. So both the oral PrEP and PrEP ring looked extremely safe. And in the boxes there, you see a couple examples of the adverse events that we saw among mothers and babies, but none related to study product. Next slide. So lots of numbers on this slide. Don't want you to worry about all the numbers here, other than to know that when we looked at Jhpiego ring, the values that we got were consistent with product use. The moms were using the ring. The Jhpiego can pass into breast milk, but in general, it does not pass in high amounts to milk or to infant plasma. So the absolute amounts that we saw here were not consistent with any kind of clinically concerning amount for the babies at all. And that makes sense. We didn't see any significant amount of safety events in the babies. So very little Jhpiego passed to milk and even less to babies. Next slide. Same thing with oral PrEP. We saw no significant transfer of oral PrEP medications to infants via breastfeeding. You can measure it, of course, in mom's blood. The moms were using the product. It does pass, the FTC TP does pass is detectable in the moms and in the babies, but in general, the tenofovir isn't really well orally absorbed by the baby, so that was generally not detected. So no significant transfer of oral PrEP medications to infants via breastfeeding. Next slide. And as I mentioned, what we saw from ring release data, drug levels were consistent with product use. Next slide. When we looked at acceptability, we saw high user acceptability for both oral PrEP and the PrEP ring. Most people found both products acceptable, high 90s in terms of acceptability, and most were willing to use their assigned product when breastfeeding in the future. So overall, extremely high for both products. Most did say that they preferred the study product to which they were assigned, but the bottom line, no difference between acceptability of the two study products for both acceptability aspects above. Next slide. So in closing, this was the first study of Jhpiego vaginal ring use during breastfeeding among mother-infant pairs. We had done a previous study, MTN-029, which looked at lactating moms, and the drug levels that we saw were consistent with those we saw in MTN-029. We didn't actually enroll babies in that previous study, so this one was the first one to enroll babies and look at drug levels in the nursing babies. Both PrEP ring and oral PrEP have favorable safety profiles among breastfeeding mother-infant pairs. Adherence and acceptability were generally high. Drug levels in breast milk and infant samples were generally low. And this does support expanding HIV prevention choices during breastfeeding to include the ring. We really think as a study team that this is ample evidence to warrant update of Jhpiego vaginal ring guidelines to include breastfeeding individuals. Next slide. And I want to provide our sincere thanks on behalf of the study team to all the participants, the communities, which were extremely supportive and wonderful partners for the study staff, and our funder. Thank you. And I am going to turn it back over to Chantel.
Thank you so much to our wonderful guest presenters. But before I let everyone go, I have a few questions for Michelle Rodolph. Michelle, so I just wanted to ask you a few questions. And the first question would be, how will the World Health Organization respond to these new findings?
Thanks so much, Chantel, for the question, and thanks to all the presenters for sharing this data. This was done in a fantastic, comprehensive format. I'm going to put my video on just because I'm just speaking. If it's any problems for bandwidths, please let me know and I'll turn it off. So how will WHO respond to these new findings? WHO, so for those of you familiar with WHO's guidance on the Jhpiego vaginal ring, and we actually, in our guidance, I'm just reading from my screen here to make sure I get it correctly, called for a research gap in safety in pregnancy and breastfeeding. And one of the items that we called for was that more research is needed for us to support the safety of ring use during pregnancy and breastfeeding. So my response is that WHO will respond favorably, and this will involve an update to our guidelines, in the WHO guidelines, the next iteration of it, and that will happen next year or two. However, in the short term, we're updating our PrEP implementation tool, the clinical module, which will now include Jhpiego vaginal ring and long-acting injectable cabotegravir. Much of this data is already public and are in the process of updating that implementation tool to include this new information. And that implementation tool should be finalized in Q1 of 2024. Thank you.
Oh, that's great news to hear. As a former study participant, it just makes me so happy to hear all of this. So that leads me to my next question, which is, what is the usual process and timeline for updating the WHO PrEP guidance?
Okay, so it's going to say it's jargon, but in WHO language we have guidance and we have guidelines. So guidance, the usual process is based, and so like the implementation tool is guidance. We a number of years ago published a technical brief on the safety of using oral PrEP, TDF-FTC and TDF-3TC in pregnancy and breastfeeding. That's guidance. So for that, when there is new evidence, new data to update what's already out there, that is what we at WHO need first in order to update new guidance. So that's in the terms of an implementation tool. So with this data right here, we can use this to update our guidance. So the first step will be with the implementation tool, which is speaking to providers. It'll come out soon. We've also in discussions about putting out a technical brief, like we did for oral PrEP for the Jhpiego vaginal ring, and supporting the safety of using the Jhpiego vaginal ring during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And I guess maybe, Chantel, I'm looking at the next question. Do you mind if I just go straight to it?
Please, feel free.
So the next update, which is really a two-part, will include updating the guidance among other things. It will include ring use during pregnancy, breastfeeding, and adolescence. Now, the piece for adolescents, as those of you familiar, in the original trials, which was, I hope I get the names wrong, there's so many names, Hope and Aspire, we didn't see the trial. I'm going to read from the guidance. The data from the trials were not able to demonstrate efficacy among women younger than 21. However, those trials weren't able to demonstrate efficacy from women younger than 21, but what we did see was that those women had very low adherence to ring use. So the data that was presented earlier from REACH will show that when young women, well, it has shown that young women, when supported properly, can use the ring. So we will have to look at this more carefully to see what we can say. I mean, from biologically, there's no reason if the ring works in a 22-year-old woman that it would not work in a 21-year-old woman. So I don't see this as a major issue.
Mm.
And then
Thank
could I just give a reflection?
Yes, please.
Just to be provocative. You know, when I prepared to speak on this panel, to have this little conversation with you, I went over the WHO guidance on the Depivrin vaginal ring and our guidance on long-acting injectable cabotegravir. And for the sake of being provocative, and I think it's something for us and our governments to think about, the WHO guidelines say almost the same thing about using long-acting injectable CAB during pregnancy and breastfeeding as they do for Depivrin ring. And both of them say that there's limited evidence to support using either CAB or the ring in pregnancy and breastfeeding. And I saw earlier in the presentation, I don't remember who shared it, but there was a table of what countries say for using Depivrin ring during pregnancy. And most countries on that table are not in favor of using the ring during pregnancy and breastfeeding. However, what I've seen sitting at the global side, that in the regulatory approvals of cabotegravir, many countries have been much more permissive in using long-acting injectable CAB during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And I think it's something for us to push our governments, your governments, on why, when there was very little data for both products to support the safety. So that's just for the sake of being provocative. I know that wasn't part of, that wasn't in my scope of work for this, but I'll hand back to you, Chantel.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm so glad that you had to share all of that in regards with the World Health Organization. It's so nice to learn that there is a different way that the World Health Organization works around the guidance and the guidelines, because to me or everyone, somebody else, this is new. But I just believe that there are young people in this webinar who are willing to grab all the information that you have shared and all the information that the guest presenters have just shared, because this is such a huge thing to take home, and this is such a huge thing to take out to the world, to the rest of Africa, to the young girls who do not have the options to make choice on their own, because we really need this products. They are a game changer to the young people, especially the discreet products. Yes, you can take oral PrEP in a secret, but yes, it's different from the Dappiring or the CAB PrEP. So yes, I still believe that earning a right for the young women, and we can tackle this and we can grab this and run away with it and expand to more options that are yet to come from our pipelines. Thank you so much for having me. Kristine, I'll take this back to you.
Thanks, Chantel.
Thank you, Chantel, and thank you for that great statement about choice for HIV prevention. And I think it is, it is exciting to have these new data available for the RAIN, and hopefully we will have similar new data available for CAB in the near future. I know in some of the country teams that we work with on the Mosaic, they have had conversations with different ministries of health and technical working groups, and really many of those governments are looking to the WHO for guidance and guidelines on this. So grateful, Michelle, that WHO is planning to incorporate these new data into their guidance and guidelines, and that hopefully that will lead to some shifts in how these products are available, who these products are available for in country. We have a few minutes. There were some questions in the chat, but many of them were responded to, particularly around male partner involvement and also around IPV and GBV. But I just want to take a few moments since we have a little bit of time left, to hear from the panelists if they have anything further they want to reflect on what's been discussed, or specifically comment on these questions around IPV, GBV, and male partner involvement. I'll open up the floor to our panelists. Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's clear that when partners are involved, adherence is better in multiple different products, including the dipivering vaginal ring. So I like this discussion of male involvement for our participants. We didn't require it. There was some concern initially when we started the trial that we might have to require it because of a fetus being involved in the study, but we didn't. I think we encouraged it throughout, though, because we have found that the more support a participant has around ring use, the more effectively and consistently she can use it.
Thank you, Katie. Any other comments from our presenters? One of the other things that often gets raised with regard to the ring and oral PrEP is this concern that individuals may switch from a more effective product, oral PrEP, to a less effective product, the dipivering ring. And yet, I think what we saw in the REACH study was that if individuals were able to use oral PrEP consistently, they stayed on oral PrEP. And it seems that mitigates some of that concern. I wonder if anyone on this call would like to respond or comment further on that.
I'm happy to comment if.
Go ahead, Michelle.
The most effective product that a person uses is the product they use is the most effective product. So this comes up time and time again at WHO. Why are you also recommending a product that doesn't have the same proven efficacy, as high in efficacy in trials as TD50C? And my response is repeatedly, a product that woman uses is much more effective than a product she's not using. So the wearing a ring is much more effective than pills staying in a bottle in your purse.
Good point. Well, maybe we will end on that high note then. Most effective product is the one that an individual can use. So thank you to all of our speakers today for your wonderful presentations. Thank you to Chantel for co-facilitating, and to Michelle for sharing WHO reflections. We have these PrEP Learning Network sessions once a quarter, so the next one will be in 2024. You can find all the recording and slides from today on PrEP Watch. The link is here and has been put in the chat. And then finally, I just wish all of you a happy holiday and good health and well-being into the new year. Thank you all.